On May 1st, 2018, we saw one of the most infamous live TV meltdowns. Now, this is up there with Mariah Carey's meltdown on TRL. This is up there with Charlie Sheen's Tiger Blood interview. This is one of those moments in live TV that will always be famous. No matter where you are, you remember when this happened. Kanye West, who had been in the midst of a mental health crisis very publicly online with a mixture of cryptic tweets and really weird outside appearances, rants on the Pablo tour, the discussions about Beyonce and Jay-Z and how their kids don't play together, all of these things had been happening more and more frequently. And I think us as a public, we're starting to see the cracks starting to form, which had long been a, best kept secret. Kanye was a little boisterous and vivacious, and he said it like he meant it. He said George Bush didn't care about black people. He was saying it how he felt. He was not going to be bullied into believing certain things. He was always going to speak his mind. I mean, hell, the infamous Taylor Swift moment that has haunted him since 2007. There have been instances in moments that had been quickly swept under the rug and made to be normal when it came to Kanye West's mental health. But on May 1st, 2018, no one could ignore it any longer.
400 years? For 400 years? That sounds like a choice. Like, you was there for 400 years and it's all of y'all? It's like we're mentally in prison. I like the word prison because slavery goes too direct to the idea of blacks. It's like slavery, Holocaust Jews, slavery is blacks. So prison is something that unites us as one race, blacks and whites being one race.
Kanye went to TMZ, and mind you, this was a week of weird public appearances and weird instances that kept making headlines. Kanye showed up out of the blue at TMZ and demanded to be interviewed on the spot, and the interview did not go well, to say the least. I mean, between blaming the public for him getting liposuction, which led to his addiction to pain pills, which led to his mental health crisis in 2016, where he was actually committed, and demanding that people see him as a free thinker, his undying support for Donald Trump, and of course, what everybody remembers the most is that 400 years of slavery was a choice comment.
400 years? For 400 years? That sounds like a choice.
Yeah. Now, Kanye, again, had been in and out of favor for a long time. His music was good, but he was getting less and less reliable in the public eye. And his loyal black core fan base finally got a taste of his general disdain for our history. Because throughout all of the different things that have happened in Kanye's career that would point to some sort of mental health crisis or some sort of need for other interventions, his black core fan base remained virtually unmovable and extremely faithful and loyal to him. It didn't matter what he did. They were going to make an excuse for him because of the music being that good, and it was that good. But him going on national TV and saying slavery, 400 years of slavery was a choice, was the final straw for a lot of black people who had been following him, who had been listening to his music, who have all been making excuses for his behavior for years. The Kardashian curse, this and that, when in actuality, Kanye West had been showing signs of mental health issues for years. Now, a lot of Kanye West stans will want you to believe that he had some sort of deep, otherworldly meaning to why he said 400 years of slavery was a choice. But I think we all knew what he was saying, and he was saying exactly what he felt. This is underscored by now in 2024, 2 lawsuits where they claim that he's been racist to people at his own workplace, racist against black people. Text messages have come out of him fetishizing white women and saying his is racist. I mean, the list goes on and on. So the White Lives Matter t-shirts at Fashion Week. I mean, the list legitimately continues to go on and on and on to prove that his comments in 2018 wasn't just some sort of misstep or mistake or something that we as a people didn't understand. He has been playing in our face for many years, and he definitely believes that. He proudly proclaims that he doesn't read books, that he's not into history, and it shows. I have to sit here and just give up props to Van Lathan, who in that moment was just somebody working at TMZ, just one of those people at the desk laughing when they're filming their show. And he stood up to Kanye. No one in that room was going to do it. He stood up and said, "You're not really saying shit. And you're so rich that the repercussions of what you're saying right now will not touch you, but you are not thinking at all." And he was able to build a successful career off of that in broadcasting, and I think that that's a great thing for him. I'm happy for his success. The thing with Kanye's statement is that it's not unique at all. It's not a unique take. People actually believe this. More people than you think actually believe this. And society is kind of built on this sentiment as well. This idea that we were too docile to fight back drips with every interaction publicly that people have with referring to Black people in our situation, in our condition. We are blamed for what happened to us. And part of that blame, I believe, is put onto the mental slavery that we've put ourselves in. That's what certain people believe. People believe that us still contemplating and discussing reparations and equality is unwarranted because we ourselves weren't slaves. They think that we can't get over slavery. They think that we are not victims of our circumstances currently. I think it's evident in how certain elitist, wealthy Black people look down at other Black people. I think this is a sentiment that has been infected and injected in our community for a long time. And it is part of the reason why we are so divided. Nothing that Kanye said that day was remotely innovative or subversive. He was speaking very much about the status quo of things. He just made news because he was a Black man saying it. And so is the hypocrisy of being a Black person in America. You are both the most threatening thing to ever exist to our democracy here in terms of your destabilizing power, but you are also too stupid to get yourself out of those situations. It's the hypocrisy of the entire slavery system just played out in modern times. We are less than human, but you sleep with us like we're human. You have kids with us like we're human. You have us feed your children with our breast milk from our children, but somehow you cannot share a bathroom with us. Somehow you can't have us sit at a lunch counter and be seen and get food and sit next to us, but we're able to raise your children and clean your house and cook your food, but we're animalistic and dirty and grimy. It is in and of itself the hypocrisy of oppressive thinking. None of it makes any sense. The only thing that makes sense is that you're Black and we're better than you. So here we are. Episode the Bloodstained Podcast. Was Kanye West right about Black people and our condition? Let's talk about it. The reality is we always fought back. What happened when only the winner's history is looked at as legitimate? What do we lose from the story? What context is missing purposely? What is sanitized? What is censored? What is never told? See, the truth is the truth is the truth. It happened, right? History is supposed to be a human accounting of what happened. And if you have to alter that human accounting or censor or hide away or lie about what happened, chances are you're probably the bad guy in the story. It's complicated when it comes to slave rebellions, when it comes to slavery, when it comes to Black people knowing their true history, because there is interference as to why we don't know a lot of stories. The Tulsa Massacre is a perfect example of this. The fact that in 2021, 100 years after it had happened, it just started to get mainstream attention shows you the power that the oppressive party has over us knowing who we truly are. And their constant interference in that discovery and in that process is why we do not know the fullness of our history. It gets to be a little problematic when you rule people with such an oppressive fist that you have to make sure they cannot access information about themselves that would be inspiring. A lot of people don't know this, but the reason why there was such a rush of black codes in the 1820s and the 1830s, specifically black codes involving literacy, access to learning how to read, access to learning how to write, all of these very important and fundamental things, was because of the Haitian Revolution. The powers that be did not want the slaves in North America to hear about what had happened in Haiti and get any ideas about what they could do, what they could leverage, how they could take control of the space. So they created laws in order to bar people from learning how to read. See, a lot of people don't get this because we're taught that slaves never knew how to read, that they were never taught how to read, how to write. But in actuality, the slave states that actually had anti-literacy laws since colonial times were in the minority. There were slaves that were taught how to read and write, and they taught other slaves how to do the same. And it wasn't reified in the law until 1820 and 1830. Between that decade, those black codes became very restricting because the powers that be were scared about what happened in Haiti, literally. And they did not want the population of slaves in North America to get any ideas, to get inspired, to try and plan anything. So they made sure to remove the ability to even hear or learn about it. And that's why oral history is so important to Black people, because that is the only way that our history has been passed down generationally without being interrupted. There is a long-standing history of resistance when it comes to slavery and their captors. Whether it's an individual resistance or collective resistance, that has always been a part of our story. This constant struggling to have some sort of freedom or to defend oneself and one's ability to have agency over oneself. To think that the slaves in slavery never fought back in any way is an ignorant thought. It is a thought based in racist science and white saviorism. Point blank, period. When I was doing this podcast, when I was researching, I was surprised to know and learn that there was powerful resistance from Africans on the African continent against getting enslaved on the individual level. There is a legacy of ways that these people were fighting for agency over self on the individual level and on the collective level. And I thought, since last episode we talked about the Haitian Revolution, which is one of the most important moments in the modern Western world period, I thought it was only fair to talk and have an episode about slave rebellions and how often slaves rebelled and the different ways it was possible to rebel. A really important and little discussed aspect of resistance when it came to slavery was the resistance upon initial capture. As slavery and the demand for slaves started to grow between the 17th and 18th centuries, different African groups started to get into the trading of flesh, the slave trade. Entire West African empires got involved in the trading of the flesh. Empires like the Dahomey or the Asante entered into the slave trade and began capturing other Africans in the interior of the continent. Now remember, we've gone over this many times in the many episodes that we've been learning together, but slavery wasn't this thing where, these white people came and they just captured all these slaves and then went on their way. There was an entire economy, an entire workflow of how people were enslaved. And part of that workflow was people hunting in the interior of West Africa and collecting slaves and bringing them and walking them to the coast. That is where the Europeans would enter the chat. Now, these people would be paid for capturing these slaves. Based on the health of these slaves and the condition of these slaves, they would be paid, and that is how they made their money. These moments of initial capture between African to fellow African were often very violent situations where a lot of times the individual would fight to the death for their freedom because they knew what was starting to happen to their people. When I was researching the Haitian Revolution and I was learning about the fact that a lot of the Haitian enslaved population came from specific regions in Africa that had a strong militaristic history when it came to resistance, whether it was fighting other tribes or fighting slave captures and slave rebellion. Wars would actually be broken out in Africa. These people were not just waiting stupidly, playing with rocks by the coast, and they were taken because smarter people saw an opportunity. These people were waging full wars to make sure that they weren't captured. And sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. These weren't simple, idiotic people. These were people that were put into a circumstance where they could not fight any longer and they were forced into this. But we treat each other and Black people in general like they were dumb enough to be captured. They were dumb enough to be made slaves, and never ever in that conversation do you place the blame where it's supposed to be placed. This was a calculated, premeditated situation. You can see that by the racial apparatus that came out of that. We talked about that in episode 2. You can see the racial sciences that came from that mentality. It was intentional. It was deliberate and it was targeted. And that is why it's a true crime story. Entire villages of men would die protecting their loved ones from slave raiders. This was common practice. So when you hear about this being real, how does that change how you're told Black people exist in the Western world? Exactly. One of the most perfect moments and dangerous moments of this entire slave trade sales funnel, if you will, is when the enslaved Africans were being sold to the Europeans. This transitional period where they would be in holding cells in different areas, waiting for the next boat to come, waiting to be chosen, were incredibly dangerous times. They were times of great organizing and great resistance by the enslaved Africans, and it was known that they were incredibly dangerous times. Coordinated revolts often took place in these holding places where slaves were being sold to the European shippers. In 1785, in Maria, West Africa, there was a coordinated revolt that broke out that was significant, to say the least. In this holding area where enslaved Africans were waiting for the next ship to come, that could be weeks or months, they were working the fields, and the Maria and the Soso broke out into a war while they were waiting for the European ship to show up. And those enslaved Africans who were waiting to be sold off to the Europeans took that opportunity in order to organize and revolt. Between 600 and 800 enslaved Africans revolted and torched the entire rice fields and the crops that the state's economy was dependent on. This revolt and its reverberations reached the Northern Rivers region, where the slaves were able to leverage their power and negotiate their freedom. There were outbreaks like that all over West Africa. Outbreaks, revolts, opportunities to resist, people running away, people escaping. It wasn't just this idea that I think gets reified even in the media that we consume about slavery, where it was just this woe is me, poor me moment. People were never accepting of their circumstances of being enslaved, and that slavery resistance continued throughout all the legs of the journey. Resistance of slavery continued throughout the changing of hands as they were all brought to the coast in order to be sold, likely getting more and more violent and more desperate the closer to the coast they got, because they knew that once they got to the coast, the likelihood of them being able to come home or be back here was unlikely. Either they were going to die on the journey or they were going to die in some foreign land. So as the possibility of leaving the entire continent of Africa got more and more real, the severity of resistance got more organized and more violent. So to Kanye West's point,
400 years, for 400 years, that sounds like a choice.
Yes, slavery was a choice, but it was not a choice made by the enslaved Africans. It was a choice made by white Europeans. When I think of a slave revolt or slave rebellion or some sort of organized action, usually my mind, before understanding and researching this episode, goes immediately to the slave ships and goes immediately to the stories I heard about enslaved people organizing on the ships and trying to get control of the ship, trying to steer the ship home, or even in general, just taking their own lives on the ship. Unfortunately, in these circumstances, the most common form of resistance was taking one's own life. The final act you had over having control over your own material circumstances, whether that was deciding to starve yourself and refusing food, though they had devices so that was impossible for some, or just getting free and jumping off the ship. That was a resistance act. No matter what anyone has to say about suicide or their thoughts on it, that was an act of resistance. That was showing that I no longer have control over my life. I don't have control over where I sit, how I clean myself, what I eat. I'm chained to dead people. This whole of the ship is packed tight and sickness is all around. I have no control over anything. I'm on a ship with a bunch of strange white people I've never seen before going somewhere I have no idea. I'm going to take control over my circumstances. I'm going to jump off. I'm going to starve. I'm going to do my own form of resistance so I can at least have control over myself one last time. But there were also instances as well of coordinated, organized revolt amongst the people on the ship. For example, I know there was at least one ship that was taken over and commandeered by the slave population, and they were able to sail that ship home. I believe it was a Portuguese ship, if I'm not mistaken. And so there was a combination of both. But again, as things got more dire and the reality of no longer having agency got more real, people were going to resist in any way they saw fit, and suicide became commonplace. Unfortunately, a lot of the exact numbers of the people who sacrifice themselves in the sea in that regard are very skewed and not accurate. There aren't a lot of records to sift through in terms of getting a real scale of the amount of people lost during the Middle Passage, taking their own lives. And that's by design. Records for over 27,000 slave ships were released. And in these reports, they discuss different slave revolts on ships. Of the 27,000 ships, there are 483 instances of slave revolts on 467 ships, broken down like this. There were 92 attacks of Africans who were not enslaved, 388 revolts led by the enslaved, and 3 incidences of at least 3 slaves taking their lives at the same time. Of those 388, 22 were planned revolts that the slaves who were involved were punished. In the French port of Nantes, where ship captains were required to submit a report of their voyage when they came into port, out of the 815 ships that reached port between 1715 and 1777, 70 had experienced slave revolts, which breaks down to 1 in every 11 ships had a slave revolt. That is far more likely than a lot of people would think or that we're taught to believe. 1 in 11 slave ships at that one port alone dealt with some sort of slave uprising, proving that even though it seemed impossible, even though they didn't know where they were going, even though they were on a ship or not on land anymore, these people were fighting back no matter what. What about after they make it to their destination, after the Middle Passage, after the revolts were either tamped down or the people involved were punished or killed publicly in order to keep people in line? What happens then? What happens when they make land, then they're sold, and now their life of servitude begins? Well, there was Nat Turner. Also, shameless plug for those who don't know, I have a Substack where I post articles, I post blog posts, I talk about myself. I'm very, very open there. So if you're interested, there's a link in the bio. There's a free version and there's a paid version. The paid version is $5 a month, $50 for the whole year. And in that paid version, I'm doing something where I'm watching a bunch of slave movies and just reacting to them. And this month, I will be posting my Birth of a Nation, the 2016 version, on there. I did post already. The 1915 version is on there. The original Birth of a Nation I'm reacting to, which is crazy. But the 2016 version I am editing now and will be posting. And that version was supposed to be subversive, and it is specifically talking about Nat Turner's rebellion. And we can get into my feelings about that movie if you want to pay the $5 a month and check out my paid version. But yeah, shameless plug. Okay. So Nat Turner's rebellion is probably the most common slave rebellion that people would just know about. It was something that shook the entire country. The white people were spooked and nervous about what was going to happen and the reverberations of Nat Turner. If you've ever read, actually, hold on. If you've ever read this book is called The Delectable Negro. In this book, they talk about how Nat Turner, once he was captured, was made an example of, and there may have been some cannibalism to his dead corpse. Yeah. Now, Nat Turner believed that he was called by God to deliver his people from slavery. He truly believed that. And Nat Turner was able to convince people from other plantations to join his rebellion through his preaching. So Nat Turner was taught to read at an early age in a religious way. He was introduced to religion hardcore by his master, and that's why he was taught to read the script, to read the Bible, to read all of these things. And that is why Christianity is such a central part to his organizing and what happened. What most people thought, especially at the time when it came to slave masters introducing their slaves to religion, it was used as a tool. We have Slavery and Christianity coming soon. That's an episode coming soon. But it was used as a tool in order to keep the enslaved population calm and docile. So the words of the Bible were used in order to have an obedient, God-fearing enslaved population. And this was a double-edged sword, because through that, Nat Turner was able to learn how to read and learn how to interpret the Bible in his own image, which was a double-edged sword. But also, it provided an opportunity for someone like Nat Turner, who had interpreted the Bible through his own lens of freedom and liberation, to travel to different plantations and preach to the slave population under the noses of the slave masters, because they just assumed that he was using the doctrine how they wanted him to use the doctrine, which was, okay, you're gonna compel them, you're going to preach to them, they're going to get passionate, you're going to mold their minds in service to us to be better enslaved people to us. But in actuality, by allowing him this avenue of some sort of agency over his life, he was able to reach much more people than he probably would have had the rebellion just started from an isolated location. He was able to build solidarity and familiarity with other enslaved people in the area that led to them being able to trust him and organize around his movement. On August 21st, 1831 at 2 a.m, Turner and his group of rebels started at his master's house and killed him and the entire family. They marched all through Southampton and, got to business. They got in the field. That's one thing about it. They got in the field. They marched through all of Southampton, Virginia, killing a total of 55 people. The white authorities crushed the revolt, but Nat Turner was able to escape capture for nearly 2 months. So also, this is where the movie kind of is fucked up, but that's a conversation for another day. Go to the paid Substack to get into that. Okay, let's get into that. But They were able to kill 55 people. They killed his master in his bed, and they went ham. And even though the white authorities were able to crush the rebellion, you can kill the revolutionary, but you cannot kill the revolution. And eventually Nat Turner was found. He was tried in Southampton court, which of course, you know, how do you think that trial was going to go? Exactly. Once he was captured, he was charged with the death penalty on November 11th, 1831. And according to this book, he had a very, very, very insane public execution. And it is alleged, I won't say alleged because I do believe it, in this book that they ate his flesh. We need to look at the horrors of slavery. The fact that slave skin was used as shoes. This is a horror movie. This is horror. This is a horror genre. Like, get into this. This is horror. Anyway. So they had to make an example out of him, obviously, because of the success of his ability to organize. And the entire South was freaked out from that point on. And obviously, you know, it's one of those things where they didn't expect it to happen until it happened. It wasn't a thought they had about the organizing ability of African slaves. They didn't even consider that they knew what to do or how to communicate or organize at all or resist at all. So once it happened, the entire South was aflame with fright and fear and all of this stuff. Nat Turner's rebellion had such intense reverberations that the legislation around slavery became tighter and more controlling. It became a fear-based thing. It became something where we had to control this population and keep them in their place because of what Nat Turner had attempted to do and his ability to succeed. I think it's important to put a pin in this because I have a thought about how Nat Turner's rebellion, one of the most famous instances of slave rebellion, is taught and discussed with us. I've talked about this before, but I'm going to talk about it again, particularly because when I was watching the 2016 version of Birth of a Nation, that was detailing this idea of being an exception, being a symbol, being chosen by God was instilled from the very moment that movie started. And I have a problem with that because the truth of the matter was Nat Turner was incredibly smart and he seized his opportunity in order to organize, which is important to bring credit to and bring shine to because it proves that the idea of a slave being stupid or docile or simple is just simply not true. Instead, when these stories are told to us, like in this 2016 version, they make it seem like these people were just so out of this world. Like Nat Turner wasn't a human with human capabilities who made human decisions and decided to fight tooth and nail for freedom in one way or another. They make it seem like God handpicked this dude, and because of his connection with the Lord, that is what gave him the strength to be able to carry this out. They flatten the work, the different people involved in making this able to be pulled off. They flatten that whole narrative to make it seem like this is an unattainable thing because God chose this guy. When in actuality, this was a person who was enslaved, who was smart, who took an opportunity. And a lot of people took their opportunities and took their moments when it was time. It wasn't he was handpicked by the Lord. We need to praise him. He was a natural born this and that. He was a person who saw a moment, a window of opportunity to resist his material circumstances, and he took it. And we all can take our freedom back as soon as we want to. Power to the people, child. Power to the people. Slavery was not monolithic, but plural, a singular community with many neighborhoods within it. Nat Turner Neighborhoods, page 706. Now, I found this amazing resource, amazing paper written about Nat Turner's rebellion and kind of understanding the successes of it. And I thought this quote was extremely important because I think a lot of people flatten again the work that was done by Nat Turner in order to foster trust amongst different enslaved people. Just because you were black, just because you were enslaved, just because you were enslaved in the same county did not necessarily mean that you would get along or you were automatically loyal to each other. There was a community of plantations, and each plantation was its own ecosystem, was its own contained system. A lot of people never left the plantation. That was their whole world. So for Nat Turner to go around and be able to gain trust from all of these different areas and build solidarity in order to have a successful rebellion, that work is something that needs to be acknowledged, because just because we're enslaved doesn't mean that I look at you with trust, doesn't mean that I look at you and know that I'm willing to organize with you and I'm willing to be loyal with you, because of the stakes. So much can happen. Step out of line, you are going to be crushed to the point that you never even think about doing that again. So to take a chance on somebody that you do not know, that you did not grow up with, that is just a visitor on the plantation, is a big risk. And however you want to slice it, people may say his rebellion wasn't successful. People may say it was successful. I think it was successful in the fact that it showed the ability that people can organize. Enslaved people are not simple or too simple to just accept their circumstances. And it clearly, by the heavy crackdown, it shook the core of the country, the foundation of the country. But we can't just say that he was chosen by God and then blindly try and erase all of the work that had to be done in order for something like this to be pulled off successfully. Now, I just want to take a moment to take us out of the past and bring us to the present. When I was writing this script, October 7th had just happened. I'm recording this months later. As we know, everything has completely I don't even know where to begin. But what I will say is this, people who think that as a Black person, caring about what's happening in Gaza right now doesn't affect you, as a person who doesn't understand that it's important that we collectivize under the atrocities that have all happened to us, the experiences that we share, because we are stronger together. We cannot take on this system one at a time. We have to learn how to work together. It is important to draw the parallels. People idolize these moments in history, but when they're happening, they are not on the right side of history. People are going to look back at what is going on now in Palestine, what people in Gaza are going through, this genocide, this ethnic cleansing that's been happening for over 75 years. And they are going to try and pontificate on that shit and make movies like they tried to make a movie about Nat Turner's rebellion right now in order to use that as leverage to be seen as someone who is aware and woke and in touch with their humanity. I implore everyone just to pause and to pay attention to what people are doing actually in the moment. And you are seeing what they would have done when slavery was happening. You are seeing what they would have done in the Holocaust. You're seeing all of that shit. The ability for people to be controlled by information is something that is incredibly important to the situation that's going on right now. The powers and the apparatus that was spreading misinformation about violence and Islamophobia, xenophobia, and just straight up fucking lies after October 7th is the exact same institution doing the exact same thing that keeps my history from me in order to make me a docile individual. Exact same apparatus that push racialized sciences. It's the exact same apparatus that oppresses us all over the globe. Point blank, period. It doesn't matter if it's connected to some kind of form of Judaism or whatever. The truth is the truth is the truth. And the people right now are showing you what they would have done during the Haitian Revolution. They're showing you what they would have done during the Holocaust. They're showing what they would have done during the Rwandan genocide. They're showing you. So believe them. Believe what they're showing you. Believe how they are acting in this moment. And understand that people can say a lot of shit, but it's the actions behind it. And it's clear that the same old dusty narratives, the same old dusty, crusty dehumanization from the fucking Crusades still fucking works on people in 2024. We need to talk about the Maroons. I don't know how else to put it. It is one of the most important topics. If you're going to talk about slavery and not discuss the Maroons, you are missing out on such rich history of resistance and important information. For me personally, the Maroons is an incredibly important aspect of how I was introduced to slavery. My mom, at every chance she got, whenever I was young, making a report or doing something of that regard, always would make a point to choose something for me to research that had to do with me being Black, with slavery, or something of that nature. I remember in the third grade, I did a report about Mae Jemison, who was the first Black woman in space, things like that. She would always seize the opportunity to give me something to learn about when it came to my Blackness from a point of pride. And so my entry into learning about slavery was learning about the Maroons, and she making me research, do a whole research paper on the Maroons for a specific thing. And I think it was fourth grade. And it informed everything about how I view slavery. Now, the Maroons, if you don't know what I'm talking about, in the Central and South America, in the Caribbean, there was different groups of people. The Maroons is what they're called, but, in a general term to refer to them existing, but there are different collective groups of people on different islands who either were formerly enslaved or were never enslaved or never able to be enslaved, that created their own closed villages of free spaces for themselves, where they governed themselves while slavery was still happening on the same island. Maroons were descendants of course, African enslaved people or African people in general, and the indigenous populations of the respective islands that they were brought to. And they either resisted from the jump to being enslaved and were able to survive in the mountainous regions, in the more remote parts, and create a community of their own that was free, where they had agency over themselves, or they were able to free themselves or escape and were able to join one of these communities that had already existed. As I said, they existed all over Central and South America. Mainly, there was a big Maroon population in Jamaica, and since I'm Jamaican, that was something that was important for my mom to tell me about. So that's why I did a report on the Jamaican Maroons, obviously. The word maroon was entered into the English language in the 1590s from the French adjective marron, which means feral or fugitive. So you already see that, just by the fact that this new word had been brought into the English language at this particular time, you see that there was this culture of resistance happening already at the earlier stages of slavery. One of the first slave rebellions that ever was recorded was on Christopher Columbus's son's sugar plantation in what is now modern day, the modern day Dominican Republic. Unfortunately, it was swiftly crushed on December 26, 1522. The first Maroon settlements came as a direct result of that rebellion. Now, it wasn't easy. Surviving in a Maroon community was extremely hard. You had to deal with constant paranoia, checking behind your back, making sure they couldn't access your community where your children and your family were. It was difficult getting food. Sometimes they'd have to go down to the plantation in order to steal crops from the farms, steal animals, all of that, which made it extremely dangerous for them to either be killed or re-enslaved. They were able to build very rich and important cultures as a Creole indigenous African population on all of these islands because of their need and their pull and their just general, every fiber of their being, their need to be free. They're fighting for freedom. No matter how much it took from them, they were going to be free. Now, obviously, the Maroon communities existed all over Central and South America and the Caribbean, but no Maroon population was as ruthless, as detrimental to the British Empire as the Jamaican Maroons. Beginning in the late 17th century, Jamaican Maroons were constantly battling the British, okay? They were taking the British on fully. They're battling the British Army, leading to the First Maroon War from 1728 to 1740, which is a long-ass war. This war was so brutal that the British governor of the Jamaican colony, Edward Trelawney signed a treaty with the Maroon population on the island, giving them over 2,500 acres of land to live separately from the British Empire and to be self-sufficient. Now, these two species of land were in both Western Jamaica and Eastern Jamaica. There's Trelawney's Town in Western Jamaica and Crawford's Town in Eastern Jamaica. And the only way they were able to exist freely on these patches of land was if they agreed to capture any slave that tried to defect to their land. They had to commit to betraying their people in order to have their freedom, which was common. This idea of your own bearing the brunt of your enslavement is something that isn't new, and I think it's definitely something that causes division within our community. That is why I do not support just black faces in high places, because oftentimes they trot the black person out to say the most ridiculous, stupid, fucked up shit to make us not feel comfortable or safe in organizing amongst each other. Look at Kamala Harris. Look at the press secretary currently for Trump. Look at these people in the UN vetoing these ceasefire situations. These are people of color. Look at how, what's her name? Condoleezza Rice was used. Look at all these people. They are used in this very same way where it's like, okay, we'll cut a deal with you individually, but you also have to do our bidding on the back end, and you have to capture these slaves if they try to defect to you. That's the only way we will give you this land. So you're forced to choose between self-preservation and your own people, which is why I think solidarity, even amongst Black people as a collective, is very hard. Because of the first Maroon War in Jamaica, these Maroons were able to negotiate their freedom over a century before the British Empire would abolish slavery. That's crazy. But of course you wouldn't know that, because that's not thought of as valuable history to the narrative at play. And the narrative is white superiority, right? So you can't have these situations where it's clear that people who had less than you, who were enslaved or, living off of less food, less access than you, were able to spank you that bad. But this is a common theme. Go back to the Haitian Revolution episode, okay? It is time for a global revolution. It is just time for one. And ultimately, I think it's important that we begin to arm ourselves with real, true information while it's still readily available, because we need to build the solidarity and build the trust and repair relationships amongst all marginalized individuals globally. What Kanye said, as Van Lathan said, was stupid, idiotic, was a bunch of nothing speak. And of course, 6 years later, we've been proven correctly about him and his motives and his morals, even though Black women have been saying it for years. And we've been gaslit into believing that he wasn't really that way. He's been that way. And it's important for us as a people to understand our history, to be able to be proud of it. Slavery was a choice, but it wasn't a choice made by us. And the sooner we stop blaming ourselves for circumstances that were not of our control, the easier it will be for us to be able to actually see our circumstances for what they are and attack the real problem. They have carefully constructed infighting, so many different situations, that it's important for us to be steadfast. We are going against a deliberate system, an attack on a community. We're going against people who do not see humanity. And they haven't seen humanity for hundreds of years. Slavery was a true crime story. The reverberations, the mind tricks, all of the things that they do in order to censor and conceal the truth of what happened and who's to blame all of it works in order to create divisiveness and fracturing amongst marginalized people so that we cannot collectivize against the villain, who we know is the villain, who's always been the villain, who continues to be the villain to this day in 2024. That being said, Black Lives Matter, free Palestine until it's backwards. Love you.